Here's the outline of this video. In the description are timestamps for each section, as are the sources. I request that before writing a comment such as, "How are you defining race?" or "Why are you even talking about this?" that you please make an attempt to self-answer or find the relevant sections. The nature of the dispute. The first thing that anyone interested in the dispute on race needs to know is that there is no qualitative disagreement. Specifically, if we are referring to the cause of the observed variance in, say, SAT scores between the group of people defined as American blacks and the group of people defined as American whites, there is virtually nobody who claims that 100% of the racial differences are down to environment. I have put here three boxes, one representing the genetic determinist position, the hereditarian egalitarian spectrum, and the environmental determinist position. And this can be in regards to race differences, in regards to gender differences, in regards to the total variance amongst individuals. Now this video will be dealing mostly with race, or almost entirely with race. I personally do not know of a single genetic determinist on any issue, period. As far as I can tell, they only exist in the minds of militant egalitarians. And while I only know of a single environmental determinist who claims to be one, I know of several egalitarians who have never given me an estimate on the genetic proportion of the racial gaps. That is, they will make several arguments as to why the racial gaps are environmental. That is, they will put forth many environmental propositions. However, they will never say how much this environmental proposition explains of the racial gap, and they will never provide an estimate for the environmentality of the gap. Oh, you think 10% is genetic? Do you think 10% is 20%? What is the genetic proportion? And can you make a case for why you think there is this small genetic proportion? They will never do anything like that. Continuing. Perhaps one could be an environmental determinist before analyzing it. It's amazing. People will have dreams where something completely nonsensical happened, then they'll think it happened until they actually analyze it for just a few seconds. Similar things will happen with Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. I held this sort of plenary environmental determinism until I thought about it for a moment. Wait a minute, evolution. Humans out of Africa. Also, the brains are different sizes, with the largest brains had by Inuits and more northerly Native American groups. This isn't to say that those with the biggest brains will have the highest IQs, but the fact stands that the races differ in average brain size. And what a cosmically unlikely outcome it would be that they would end up with brains that work the same way, all over the place. Perhaps the differences are very slight, and the overwhelming bulk of the observed racial disparities are down to differences in environment and histories, but the differences in brain size and basic evolutionary logic rule out environmental determinism. If we look at something like IQ, there is no universal heritability of that trait. So when you say the observed variance of IQ is 80% down to variance in environment, there's a lot of questions. Is this the variance between two predefined groups? Is it the variance amongst all individuals in a given area? Is it the variance amongst all individuals in the US or in Botswana or on the whole planet? Or between Koreans and the group we define as Hispanics in Canada? The environmental and genetic component of variance in any trait depends on the environmental and genetic variance present in any given situation or comparison. So when, for example, the skeptical heretic or Philippe Rushton claim that hereditarianism means that you believe that more than 50% of the observed variance in a trait is down to genetics, that is evidence that those people don't know what they're talking about because there is no universal heritability. One can be, for example, a racial hereditarian but a gender egalitarian in regards to the IQ variance in the United States, meaning that you lean more towards environment for explanation of the gender differences and more towards genetics in explanation for the racial differences. You can also lean more towards genetics for explanation of the variance between European Americans and African Americans, and more towards environment for explanation of the IQ variance between African Americans and people called blacks in South Africa. If you controlled for environment completely, if you put two groups of people, say Polynesians and Inuits, into a compound where environment was 100% the same, then any variance in IQ, or in physical strength or anything else between these two groups, would be down to genetics. so we can construct an environment where the variance would be almost 100% down to genetics, so it's possible for that to be the case. So why is it that people who think that variance in, say, SAT scores between the races are altogether about 80% explained by genetics are said to be like creationists, when it's clearly a possible outcome? And if you wish to say that this idea of a high heritability of the variance was debunked long ago, what are you saying? Are you saying that in the 1970s they showed that the racial variance in SAT scores today are down to environmental factors? This subject is never over and the world is always changing. Another thing to consider is that heritability does not mean that a trait is fixed. For example, imagine Bill and Bob. Bill is skinnier than Bob, okay? In January, the variance in muscle between Bill and Bob is, let's say, 100% down to genetics. Just for simplicity's sake, let's say it's 100% down to genetics. Neither work out. They both eat whatever they want, and they're both sedentary. There's probably some tiny, slight environmental difference by this lifestyle, but let's just pretend that it's 100% genetics. But one day, Bill, the skinnier one, decides to start lifting weights. In 6 months, Bill becomes buffer than Bob, even though the difference beforehand was 100% down to genetics. It is possible that, even if the black-white IQ gap was 80% down to genetics, blacks could, through superior mental training, get higher IQs than whites on average, or that whites could extend their lead even further. Even if a gap between two individuals or two groups of individuals is 100% down to genes, that doesn't mean it's fixed, because the environment for both parties can change. The inverse of this concept is also true. Let's say that women today are taller than men were in the year 1000 AD. And let's say that the growth in height from the year 1000 AD to today is 100% due to changes in environment. Does this mean that the current height gap between men and women today is a result of environmental differences? Of course not. The current height gap could be 100% down to genetics, but both men and women could increase or decrease their average height in response to changes in environment. So just because something changed over a long period of time in response to changes in environment does not mean that the current gaps are due to environment. And this is relevant in regards to the Flynn effect, and anyone who knows what that is probably knows why this is a response. So hopefully this explains the nature of the dispute. This video, of course, is about race, and before talking about race differences, we need to figure out what races even are. So, to establish what races even are, we can look at the Neil Risch study, the data presented here. On the side, we see the self-identified race of the individuals in this study, or the social construct. And along the top, we see the genetic cluster they were assigned to, a best fit genetic cluster based on an analysis of 326 base pairs. What we see is a correspondence between self-identified race and genetic cluster of 99.86% in this American sample. Interesting that Hispanics function as a fairly separable and discrete race, given that ancestry analysis generally finds Hispanics to be 60% European and 40% Native American, but apparently that 40% Native American is more than enough to identify them. This study also explains why Lewontin's fallacy is a fallacy. The way races differ is not that race A is different and has different genes than race B, but that they have different frequencies of gene variants. For example, the gene DTNBP1 varies by race. There are different variants of these genes, but each variant can be found in all races. Let's construct a simple model to illustrate the principle. Say there is race A and race B, but every gene in each person's genome has only 2 variants. The B variant occurs with 60% frequency in race B, and the A variant occurs with 60% frequency in race A. Now, if you were to look at just one gene and try to separate the races apart on that one gene, the correspondence between social race category and genetic cluster would be 60%. But if you used 10 genes, then you would be correct, or there would be a correspondence 63.3% of the time. If you used 100 genes, you would be correct 97.3% of the time, and if you used 326 genes, which is as many was used in the Risch study, you would be correct 99.98% of the time. Of course, in reality, the frequency differences between races aren't all inverses of each other, and some genes vary racially more than others. When you hear someone say that there is more genetic variation within a race than between them, either they don't know what they're talking about, or, which is most likely, or if they do know what they're talking about the cumulative variation of each gene. And while this is true, the likelihood that your overall genetic structure is more similar to someone of another self-identified race than to someone of your own race is virtually zero. Note that the genetic clusters the researchers found in the Risch study weren't based on height. The best fit wasn't to lump in people by height. The best fit was race. Moreover, the Hispanic population, in the U.S. said to be 60% European and 40% Native American, could be separated apart from the other groups and treated as its own race. So the question as to whether or not race exists is not a question that has an answer, because it's just a category. It's just a group of people, and it changes over time. At one point, there were those who said that the Italians and the Germans were different races. Now, we can probably do some DNA tests and distinguish Italians and Germans. Does that mean that they're separate races? We can separate them genetically. At one point, they were considered separate races. Are they? Well, that's not really a question that has an answer. Let me posit a hypothetical that puts this question into a proper context. Imagine two groups of people, the dimpled and the non-dimpled. The dimpled have an average IQ of 90, and the non-dimpled have an average IQ of 110. And this IQ variance is 100% down to genetics. Now, if I pointed this out, and that the lower dimpled economic outcomes was not a result of, the oppression of the dimpled, would the argument that race doesn't exist, or race is a social construct, make any sense at all? Are the dimpled a separate race? Do they have to be a separate race to recognize the difference between these two groups? Again, it's not a question that has an answer. Clearly, they're separate something. Human differences are real, and they tend to cluster. That's all. You can call it a race or not. Now, the mile-high view. The thing to know is that when IQ is controlled for, income differences between races go away in the United States. Blacks, whites, and native-born English-speaking Hispanics have the same incomes. Their income differences go away when their average IQ is set to 100. On the other hand, when income is controlled for, which is something that a lot of egalitarians like to point out, when income is controlled for, IQ differences between the races go away. So, which is causing which? Is the IQ causing the income, or is the income causing the IQ? Well, I'm just going to say that there is a general consensus. Now, consensus doesn't mean something is necessarily correct. I'm just going to say that there is a general consensus regarding the heritability of IQ for adults generally defined as 21 years or older, in the United States. And this general consensus is around 0.8 in the United States. Now, there's an increase in heritability with age that is quite profound, which is where a lot of the arguments come from. According to Alan Kaufman and Elizabeth Lichtenberger, in a book, which I forgot the title of and I don't have written down in the script here, they estimate the heritabilities of IQ in the U.S. being as follows. The low 0.40s between ages 4 and 6, the mid 0.50s between ages 6 and 21, and the mid 0.80s for those over 21. Next, another thing to consider in regards to the race question is that there's more variance in income within each race than there is between each race. Who cares? Why does this matter? Well, a general heritability of 0.85 for those over the age of 21 in regards to IQ encompasses all people. And this includes the variance within racial groups and between racial groups. Now, if that number is true, 0.85, or let's say 0.8 is true, or at least close to the truth, we should expect, if we presume that income levels are, some rough proxies for environment, that the proportion of the racial gaps should be even more heritable than the general heritability is for IQ, because there is even less environmental variance between the racial averages than there is between two random people of the same race if we treat income as a general proxy for environment. See how this works? Now, I'm just going to flash here on the little screen here some global data on the average IQs of various states based on various studies. And what you find looking at the interstate IQ data is the profound racial clustering. And what you see is, for example, in Eastern European states, comparing that to the average purchasing power of Afro-Americans, is you get something of an idea regarding the importance of income on IQ, or I should say the lack thereof, until you get down to really, really low levels where you get significant malnutrition in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see, but if you look at an international comparison, you see a very clear stratification between states based on their predominant racial populations. And if you look within states, you see the same kind of racial ordering or hierarchy. I don't like to use that term, but that's kind of the way, the easiest way to describe it, and that's really how most people, quite frankly, see it. You look at within Brazil, East Asians, predominantly Japanese immigrants to Brazil, have the highest IQs, followed by the indigenous Brazilians, followed by the Africans. And this pattern is seen in Britain. This pattern is famously seen in the United States. It's the same pattern that's seen in Canada. Wherever this data exists, you see the same kind of racial stratification. What does that mean? Well, I'm not going to pronounce what it means, but I think the data is what it is. The environmental line. Now, in these next two sections, I'm going to go over environmental explanations and why they generally fail, except for two that don't fail entirely, and that is breastfeeding and womb environment. And in the other section, I'm going to go over a few things making a genetic case. Some more spoilers is that the genetic case is actually quite fuzzy and quite thin, meaning that there's not a whole lot to go on. It's just that the environmental explanations fail even harder. However, I do believe that there's enough to make a genetic case for it to be decisive, though it's not this overwhelming shock and awe thing that one might presume you would need. Just a note to get this out of the way, SAT scores correlate with IQ test scores. Stanford, Binet, Wechsler, Wunderlich, all the big IQ tests. SAT scores generally correlate with these tests at around 0.86. Now, the internal reliability of IQ tests is about 0.87, meaning that a person taking the same IQ test twice, their IQ score correlates with their own IQ score taken at a later date at 0.87. So that gives you an idea of the fluctuation in IQ scores. The SAT correlates with one's score on an IQ test at about the same rate as one's IQ test correlates with itself, meaning that the SAT can be used, practically speaking, as an IQ test. Now, one wouldn't want to use the SAT in order to diagnose certain cognitive problems. For example, a deficit in visual spatial reasoning, you wouldn't want to administer the SAT in order to try to figure out some specific problem that they have, okay, in some diagnostic thing. Test bias. Now, test bias has already been somewhat addressed by the fact that IQ and SAT tests predict equally for all races. So if there is test bias, it happens to be precisely identical to the biases that exist in universities and the economy at large, right? Meaning that for every race, one's score on an IQ test predicts for their future college performance for, say, a black person, as it does for an Asian person, as it does for a white person, as it does for any person of any race. So if there is a bias in the SAT, this bias just so happens to precisely mimic whatever biases there exist in the university system at large, which would be something of a profound coincidence. It seems much more likely that the identical predictive ability for all races is evidence that the SAT is not biased in any detectable way, at least racially. I'm sure it's biased in terms of culturally. If you come over from some other country, it may be biased against you. But in terms of on a racial basis, it does not appear to be biased. Okay, so maybe it's not test bias, maybe it's the schools. Maybe white kids just go to better schools. If you had the black kids and the Hispanic kids going to the better schools, then they would be scoring higher on these standardized tests. Well, problem. Voucher studies have been done, and these voucher studies generally show that the school you go to doesn't really matter. Meaning that these studies, what they would do is they would take kids who applied for vouchers, and there are only so many vouchers available. The kids who got the vouchers, who applied for them and got the vouchers, did no better than the kids who applied for vouchers and did not get them. Meaning that of all the voucher applicants, whether or not you got the voucher or not didn't really matter. Meaning that the school, being able to go to the school you wanted to, did not have any statistically significant effect. Meaning what mattered was not the school, what mattered was the students. And let's be clear here, this doesn't mean that there can't be radical reforms in education that benefit everyone. In fact, I have some very specific reforms that I would like to see done. But what it does mean is that the currently existing variance in school quality doesn't seem to be the cause of the current variance in student performance generally, in terms of GPA, SAT scores, or college performance after high school. And I kind of feel gross saying that, as if school performance is some ideal to be achieved. But I don't want to be fatalistic here, and I don't want to say people are doomed by their IQs or whatever. If I said race differences in muscle mass are down to genetics, and let's say that's true, and you're Asian or whatever, and you happen to be skinny, does that mean that you're doomed to be skinny forever? No. If you're Asian, you're probably a bit scrawny by nature, but you can lift weights, and there are plenty of East Asian people with fantastic muscles. But your individual actions aren't going to change the reason for the overall average racial disparity, and that's what I'm talking about here. Stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the idea that people will have test anxiety based on their race if certain key words or phrases are said, or if, for example, the test taker is asked what their race is. The prototype study, the model study, is the Claude Steely study, where he showed that in the presence of no stereotype threat, black and white college students performed about what their SATs had before said, meaning that these groups had the same average SAT scores coming in, and when they took a sample test made by Claude Steely, they scored about the same, about what their SAT scores would predict. So no surprises there. But when race was mentioned, the black scores took a nosedive. Now that's interesting. And while the Steely study has been replicated many times, in fact I've seen pages claiming that there's over 100 replications. I don't know about that, but there are two things that prevent stereotype threat from gaining traction outside of certain limited circles, in my opinion. And the first thing is that, one, no study that I know of to date has raised a group's score above a prior baseline by removing stereotype threat. For example, in the Steely study, the no stereotype threat condition resulted in a test score at roughly the same as the prior baseline. experimental studies have been able to get groups to perform worse than a prior baseline in the presence of stereotype threat, but not better than a prior baseline by removing stereotype threat. And two, and more importantly, is that actual field studies generally show that there's no real existence of stereotype threat. And this is key. Just because you can create an effect in a lab doesn't mean that that effect exists outside of the lab. Now, there are some natural experiments done regarding stereotype threat using the SAT, AP tests, ASVAB, and computerized placements tests, which are apparently used for course placement in community colleges. Now, in these 4 tests, sometimes they would ask for a person's race, and sometimes they would not ask for a person's race. There was no standardized protocol as to whether or not you are to gather data on the race/ethnicities of the test takers. There's just no standard protocol, and so this ended up being a natural experiment. It wasn't designed to experiment and to test stereotype threat, but it just happened to be a natural experiment. And of course, it would be unethical to carry out stereotype threat studies in the field in terms of tests that actually have teeth by design, because the hypothesis is that there would be a stereotype threat effect. Well, the results were that it didn't matter. The only time that there was a statistically significant stereotype threat effect was on the AP math portion. But in this instance, in this case, females scored lower on math when there was a gender prime, right? And that's all they found. There was no statistically significant stereotype threat effect regarding race. And according to a meta-analysis done by Thomas Way, only about 58.4% of published experimental studies, not field studies, not looking at tests with teeth, but these little tests created in a laboratory that don't have any real world impact, only about 58.4% of published experimental studies show a stereotype threat effect, whereas 25.6% show no effect, and 16% showed reactance, where the group actually scored higher than the baseline in the presence of stereotype threat. So even the experimental studies aren't as one-sided as the pushers of stereotype threat like to make out. And here, what I want to do is present a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that when you're taking the SAT, ASVAB, or GRE, or anything like that, you're giving it 100% effort. Your effort is 100%. If you're taking a little stereotype threat test in a laboratory, one of these rink-a-dink tests cooked up by a psychologist, and doesn't really matter, your effort is not 100%. Now, what does this do? Well, effort then becomes a significant discriminator here in these little laboratory studies, because when you're out taking the SAT, everyone's going 100%. So effort is not an issue. And the only thing that discriminates the students is real ability in terms of their innate ability and how, and of course the conditions the day of the test, what they ate, if they got enough sleep, all that kind of stuff. But effort is not a real issue. Whereas in these rink-a-dink, invite a bunch of students into a room and have a little psychology test with a little test, their effort is not going to be 100% because that test doesn't have any real effects on their life. And when someone is either told that they're dumb or that their race is mentioned and they think Dumbo, oh, black, I'm black, dumb, right? And either don't put in as much effort on the test, or for minority studies, they might actually react to this stereotype, say, I'm gonna stand against the stereotype, and I'm actually gonna put in more effort, and thus they score above that of, say, the white students who aren't affected negatively by stereotype threat. Now, Jelt Wichards has done work on publication bias regarding stereotype threat, and I've sent him some emails, and he says that there is evidence of publication bias, but right now I don't know how much. I contacted him asking him for a quick and dirty explanation as for why he thinks there is publication bias, but he said that he doesn't want to make it his case at all before he has all of his ducks in a row. So, and that kind of made me a little bit angry. I just want kind of a, why do you think there is? What's your hypothesis for this? And he said, oh no, I'm not going to say anything until I have it all set out. And like a typical scientist, always wanting to be sure of things before making public pronouncements on them. Now, specifically in regards to race, we know that African Americans generally have higher self-esteem and higher intellectual self-assessment than European Americans. Moreover, if we look at either the SAT or IQ gaps, we see that the racial gaps have been relatively stable, and that they are similar worldwide. So this stereotype threat thing would have to be roughly the same everywhere on the planet, and it would have to be the same since 1917, and curiously, this stereotype threat effect seems to impact the most heritable subtests, but I'll get into that in a later section. Also, businesses and universities in general must have just as much stereotype threat as exists on those tests, because IQ predicts for college and income as well for Hispanics, Africans, and Europeans in the U.S. So this is a profound similarity, a profound coincidence, kind of like with test bias. Adoption studies. I used to think that adoption studies were the gold standard of this debate, but I no longer think that. And the reason for that is the sample. The 4 adoption studies that are used to most commonly deal with this dispute are the Moore Adoption Study, the Willerman Adoption Study, the Eiferth Adoption Study, and the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. The Willerman Adoption Study was designed to determine the effect of maternal race, and they found that when economic status was controlled for, mixed race offspring with a white mother, or mulattoes, a black parent and a white parent. So mulattoes with a white mother had a higher IQ than mulattoes with a black mother. And the theory here is that since the mother is more important than the father in regards to child rearing, people of European descent invest more in their children. However, in the Willerman study used 2 control groups of children with 2 white parents and 2 black parents. And what was found is that the mixed race cohorts still fell in between both groups. The IQ tests were administered at an early age, and there was no follow-up, i.e. we weren't able to see if the mixed race children's scores began to converge with time, as I would predict, and as has occurred in the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. Okay, one thing I forgot to add regarding the Willerman study is that apparently the samples that the white mother, black father interracial offspring, the white mother, black fathers averaged about 1 year more in education than the black mother, white father. So in prior I had said that all of this was controlled for. Apparently it was not controlled for, and so and also in the Willerman study, the parental IQs apparently were not known. So, and since education tends to correlate rather well with IQ, I mean not always, but over the averages, education level correlates with IQ. It's safe to assume that the white mother, black father pairings had an average higher IQ than the black mother, white father pairings in the Willerman study. The Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study was done with 4 cohorts: the non-adopted whites, the control white groups, the adopted whites, the adopted mulattoes, and the adopted blacks. In the study, there was early parity at age 7, but the gaps widened by age 17. As for the higher score of the non-adopted whites, the egalitarian may be tempted to say that that has to do with the womb environment or very early babyhood environment, but they don't know that. It could be genetics. There could be the genetic difference between the adopted whites and the non-adopted whites, or it could be a mix of both of intermediate proportions. Eiferth. With Eiferth, first off, the Africans included in the Eiferth study included North Africans between 15 and 20%. The fathers in the Eiferth study were not a random sample. They were the African soldiers who managed to pass the Army's IQ test, and so were more of an elite sample than the European American soldiers in the U.S. Army, because more blacks were cut off, so we're dealing with a more elite sample. And they were the soldiers who happened to be able to rape a few German women, and so we don't know if that was a selecting factor. And the IQ tests were given to young children with no follow-up. And if you break down the data by gender on the Eiferth study, there's something going on that all points to Eiferth being crap. I don't even entertain it, and I don't know why anyone even bothers to use the Eiferth study. Now, the Moore Adoption Study purports to show pure black children in white households performing better on IQ tests than mulatto children in pure white households, which is said to be evidence that the parenting that people of European ancestry provide is causing the observed variance, not the genetics, similar to what was argued in the Willerman study. Now, the flaw in this study is the sample. The sample is clearly elite, as all scores are well above 100 for both the mulatto groups and the black groups. The study did not use a random sample as Minnesota Transracial did, nor a representative sample as Willerman did, and in fact the study doesn't even claim to be either a random or representative sample. I would count the adoption studies generally as being slightly favorable to the racial hereditarian side of the spectrum, with the predictable result of environmental effects explaining some variance in children. But the truth is that there just hasn't been enough of them done, and they're just not good enough to make a determination one way or another on the basis of adoption studies. There are also some adoption studies involving Koreans, adopted Korean children sent to Belgium, and adopted Korean children being sent to the United States. In fact, several of the adopted Koreans were hospitalized for malnutrition during infancy. And these hospitalized Korean infants scored lower than the adopted Koreans who are not hospitalized for malnutrition, but they still scored higher than whites in the U.S. and whites in Belgium. Unfortunately, I didn't write down anything about the Korean adoption studies on this little piece of paper here, so I'm just going entirely off of memory here. Early intervention studies. There are 3 early intervention studies that I know of. The Perry Preschool Project, the Abecedarian Project, and Head Start. And I'm just going to show some graphs for the IQ scores of these projects, and which also show the ages of the participants, and I think the data here really speaks for itself. The early intervention programs were quite intensive, as you can read for yourself. I haven't written down what they were, but I recall that they began at at something like 6 months that these interventions began occurring, and I think Perry Preschool Project started even earlier than that. Now, in the case of the Perry Preschool Project, they started off the same. The intervention group shot up for a little while, but eventually the control group caught back up again. In the Abecedarian Project, the intervention group had higher scores right from the beginning and maintained this lead all the way through. So there's really no evidence that that being in the program helped you in any way. What there is evidence of is that this group, the group that was in the program, had a higher IQ from the beginning, all along, anyway. Head Start, on the other hand, Head Start's intervention programs are much more shallow. They start much later than either the Abecedarian or Perry Preschool Project, and they start at a later age. And the results produced by Head Start are famously not forthcoming. They're famously zip results. So there's really not much to say about Head Start. And moreover, Head Start is not even the kind of intervention that people like James Flynn would advocate. James Flynn would advocate something more like Perry Preschool or Abecedarian, and that being applied to everyone. Whereas Head Start is just not. It's not even. It's a living, breathing straw man. That's what Head Start is. Breastfeeding. Maybe it's differences in breastfeeding that are causing a certain proportion of the racial IQ gap. Well, Hispanics breastfeed more than European Americans or African American parents. And this is from WebMD. It says, quote, nationwide, 54.4% of African American mothers, 74.3% of white mothers, and 80.4% of Hispanic mothers attempted to breastfeed according to a CDC telephone survey. But the numbers shift widely based on region. Now, if breastfeeding rates are such a big deal, why are the racial IQ gaps smaller at younger than older ages, right? Because these breastfeeding, over the years of breastfeeding, we should expect that's stupid. Because you expect the years of breastfeeding, the whites to have higher IQs from the breastfeeding. So that would actually be evidence of it. But the problem is, though, that Hispanics breastfeed at the highest rate. So why don't Hispanics have the highest IQs? Well, maybe it's because of other factors overpower that. Well, the thing is, though, we have breastfeeding data for every state in the U.S. For example, Connecticut has a higher state IQ than Hawaii, and Hawaiians breastfeed more. Now, if Hawaiians didn't breastfeed as much, would they have as high an IQ as Connecticut? Oh, wait a minute, I'm getting this backwards. And moreover, red states, what I have found is that the flyover states tend to have higher breastfeeding rates than the coastal states, yet the flyover states have lower IQs. So, now I'm not claiming that breastfeeding has zero effect. Maybe it accounts for, on average, a single IQ point or something. But I don't know, because I haven't looked too deeply into this. But there's no effect of breastfeeding that pops out at you. I haven't seen anything that says, here are the effects of breastfeeding. Here's the IQ effects of breastfeeding into adulthood. Here are the racial disparities in average breastfeeding rates. And so this is the effect that we can say that the racial disparities in breastfeeding have on IQ. I haven't seen that done. And when I look at, say, Hispanics breastfeeding at the highest rate, and they clearly don't have the highest IQ, that makes one skeptical as to how much of an effect breastfeeding actually has. Maybe it has a slight effect. Theoretically, I think it does have some slight racial effect, but not much, as I'll get into later. We're talking about environment. Womb environment. Some have argued that the womb environment plays some significant role in the racial gaps. And I think that this is likely, but it's not going to be much. And the problem is that there's a great deal of parity between, what we know, African and European American children in IQ early on before the genes get more and more expressed. Now, I talk about blacks and whites, blacks and whites, blacks and whites, and it's not because I have a particular focus on this. It's just because that's where the data is. Just letting people know the data on race is blacks and whites over and over and over again, right? And that's why I'm talking about this, not because that's what I want to focus on. Anyway, if the current differences in womb environment are causing a significant portion of the current variance in standardized test scores and behavior, why is it that these racial differences in standardized test scores and behavior widen with age? In fact, according to the Tizard orphanage studies, African children, or African, I think these orphanage studies were in Britain, so Afro-British children are actually ahead of Euro-British children. But this puts the racial egalitarian in a catch-22, because while this renders the womb environment argument not very effective in terms of an explanation of the racial gaps, but now, because the gaps widen with age, it could be down to compounding environmental effects, right? It's brilliant, really. If the gaps are formed at birth, well, then that's a result of womb environment. If they widen with age, well, then that's compounding environmental effects. See, whatever the outcome is, they have some environmental explanation. Stress. Maybe race differences in stress are the cause of at least part of the IQ gap. Well, I haven't seen any real case for this. Any attempt to measure stress and the effect on IQ a given amount of stress has, and then looking at race differences in stress to explain a portion of the racial IQ gaps. Now, I have found race differences in stress hormone levels, and I'm just going to put the data up there. So, and I haven't been able to make much sense out of it. It looks to all be about the same to me. That's really all I can say. I've looked at various surveys and various polls on stress, and I found slight differences in stress here. And I'm just going to put that data. I'm not going to bother reading the data. I'm just going to put it up so you can see it, and I'm going to link to the study so you can read it yourself. There's no point in me reading off that. And you know what? Quite frankly, I think I've done more research on this stress thing than the people who bring up stress. I think if the people who say, well, there's stress differences between the races, and that's what's causing at least a portion of the IQ gap, I think if they actually looked at the data, they would be much more skeptical at the outset of this argument. Now, maybe one could quantify the effects of stress and then find that some slight differences in stress between the races explained so many points of the IQ gap, but I don't know how to do that, and I haven't seen anyone do that. So, I don't see much there at all. Toxins. What about toxins? Well, there's different levels in toxins between the races. Well, I found a little paper talking about race differences in exposure to various toxins, and here's a little chart that talks about exposure to air toxins, not water toxins, but air toxins. So what does this mean? I'm looking at here. Well, maybe if Hispanics had as much exposure to toxins, air toxins, as the Asians, whatever the Asians are supposed to be. And Asians is an overly broad category. But what does this mean? If they had as much toxins in the air that they breathe, would they have higher SAT scores and earn as much money as Asians? Like with stress, the effects of toxins are never operationalized. For example, they don't say what the effect a given amount of lead in the bloodstream has on IQ, and then determine the racial variance in lead in the bloodstream, and determine how much that explains in the variance in IQ between the races. They never do this. They never operationalize and say these are what the effects are to be. And so what I look at is I look at the group which appears to be the most exposed to toxins, Asians, and I think, why would they be most exposed to toxins? Well, I mean, my guess is that East Asians live in urban environments. Urban environments tend to be more polluted, and so that probably explains why they are more exposed to toxins and have more toxins in their bloodstream. How much of this affects IQ? I haven't seen anything to say that this affects how much of an effect of IQ this has at all, if any. Now, I don't really doubt that it has some health effects, some detrimental health effects, but then again, Asians live the longest, so even the health effects can't be that detrimental. Anyway. So now what I want to go over is the Hereditary Line. I'm going to go over the reasons why I believe the racial disparities in IQ test scores are overwhelmingly down to genetic differences. And as I said previously, these reasons might seem a little bit thin and not particularly overwhelming, and that's why I went over a lot of environmental ideas beforehand, just to show that while this may seem thin, the environmental explanations are absolute crap in comparison. And I also think that the few genetic arguments that I'm going to give are decisive. Subtest heritability. In previous videos I went over the G factor, but the topic of G has too many moving parts. It's easy to straw man, and so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to bypass G altogether and go straight to subtest heritability. Because on an IQ test, some subtests are more heritable than others. Heritability being defined as the portion of the variance that is attributable to genetics. And this gives us an excellent opportunity to test the environmental theory and the genetic theory in regards to the IQ variance between the races. If the racial variance is down to environment, then we should expect the racial gaps to be widest on those subtests with lower heritabilities. If the racial variance is down to genetics, we should expect the racial disparities to be widest on those subtests with the highest heritabilities. Let me say that again. If the racial variance is down to genetics, then the racial gaps will be widest on those subtests which measure a more genetic component of the gap. If the racial variance is down to environment, then the racial gaps will be widest on those subtests which measure a more environmental component of the gap. Both ends of the hereditarian-egalitarian spectrum make opposite predictions as to where the racial gaps will be the widest. Okay, now I brought this up, so I'm pretty sure you know what the answer is. The racial variance is highest on those subtests which are the most heritable. In fact, according to Nichols, which took a very young sample, which took 4-year-olds and 7-year-old black and white children, which is actually beneficial to the racial egalitarian as the gaps widen with age. That correlation between subtest heritability and the magnitude of the racial gap was 0.67. Okay, Jensen in 1973, in an analysis of 16 different tests, found the environmentality of a subtest anticorrelated with the black-white IQ gap at negative 0.7. Which is similar to saying that the heritability positively correlated at 0.7. And Rushton found a correlation between the impact of inbreeding depression effects, a purely genetic effect, and the magnitude of the black-white differences at 0.48, meaning he looked at the subtests on IQ tests that were most affected by inbreeding depression, and he found that the correlation between the inbreeding depression effect and the magnitude of the black-white differences on the subtest was 0.48. Now, to clarify, if the correlation was 0, that would mean that the racial gaps were equally wide on the more or less heritable subtest. That is, if the correlation between the subtest heritability and the magnitude of the racial gaps was 0, that would mean a 50-50 split, right? That means that the gap was no different whether or not the subtest was more heritable or less heritable, right? So a correlation of 0 would indicate a heritability of the racial gaps of about 50%, whereas a correlation of -1 would indicate a heritability of 0, and a correlation of 1 would indicate a heritability of 100%. And I'm going to have a little picture here that kind of explains this more easily. Meaning that a correlation of 0.5 between subtest heritability and the magnitude of the racial gap would indicate that 75% of the variance was down to heredity. However, we must control for the unreliability of the IQ test by dividing all the correlations by 0.87 and then squaring the result. So let's convert the correlations to explanations of variance. That's the first step. So when we do that, we find 0.85 of the variance is explained by Jensen, 0.835 of the variance is explained by Nichols, and 0.74 is explained by heredity according to Rushton. And then if we divide this by 0.87, we find those numbers are 0.977, 0.96, and 0.85. And then if we square each result, we get 0.95, 0.92, and 0.72. Now, of the three, Rushton's data is the outlier and actually puts the lowest heritability. However, the three scores, the average of the three, they average out to about 86%. Now, this deals with blacks and whites in the United States, And this is very close to the estimates for the general heritability of IQ. So looking at the subtest heritability, and by subtest heritability factor analysis, we come to a number that's, as an explanation of the racial gaps, that's very similar to the general heritability. Now, if you throw out Rushton's data, the heritability is much higher. But the thing is, if this is true, let's say this 86% number for the heritability of the black-white IQ gap, if this is true, does this mean that the IQ gap between, say, Hispanics and East Asians is 80%, 86% down to genetics, or the gap between Hispanics and blacks is 86% down to genetics, or that the gap between Hispanics and whites is 86% down to genetics? Sorry, my voice is going out. I don't know. I don't know what, because the data on race is overwhelmingly black and white. But if I had to guess, I would guess that the other racial gaps would be pretty close to this 86% number, based on the general heritability and based on the fact that there's more variance in income, again, within race than between races. Mixed race IQs. Well, here's another thing. There are several studies looking at mixed race populations. And the mixed race populations always have an intermediate IQ between the races that they are a composite of. Interestingly, there's even a sample from the National Longitudinal Survey of Adolescent Health which showed that East Asians had overall higher GPAs but lower verbal IQs than whites. But that mixed East Asian European populations had both GPAs and verbal IQs intermediate between both races. Now, just to know, East Asians on IQ tests, they tend to have higher performance IQs but lower verbal IQs. And so that explains the lower verbal score on this little verbal IQ test in this National Longitudinal Survey of Adolescent Health. So that's not really surprising. Oh, look, the East Asians scored lower on IQ. Well, it's only a verbal test, which is what East Asians tend to perform worse on. Now, a question that a lot of people, or a hypothesis that, well, maybe it's because East Asians, they have those weird languages. They have those weird languages that don't use letters that don't use the I don't know what kind of letters they're called, but they use weird letters. And so maybe that affects their verbal reasoning. Well, if we look at the intermediate hybrids, the East Asian European hybrid offspring, their verbal IQs is intermediate between the Europeans and the quote-unquote purebred East Asians. So that's actually evidence that the low verbal IQ of East Asians is down to genetics. So this I want to say this solves the mystery. I wouldn't hang my hat on this. I wouldn't say, look, the mixed race populations tend to have intermediate IQs. But this is evidence in favor of a more genetic explanation for race differences in IQ. And lastly, I've said this over a bunch of times, is that the gaps widen with age. And I only have data on blacks and whites, as is often the case. And what is generally known that the black-white IQ gap widens with age. Now, the heritability of IQ generally increases with age, right? That's the thing. And so as IQ becomes more heritable, the black-white IQ gaps widen, and the black-white IQ gaps are widest on the subtests that are the most heritable, right? So that's it. So when you take these things together, you start doing a little bit of picture painting, and it becomes hard to deny a very large heredity component to the racial gaps. You can't find the genes. You can't find the genes. This is true. Nobody so far has been able to explain the racial IQ gaps in IQ scores with reference to specific genes. That is, they can't say this gene causes this many IQ points, this gene causes this many IQ points, and the races differ on these genes in this many ways, so the genes explain this much of the IQ gaps. Nobody has been able to do that. As of 2010, geneticists in general, as I have heard from two sources, as always linked in the description, have only been able to explain about 10% of the observed variance in height in the United States. And specific genes, said to be genes for intelligence, have so far all been shown to be either false positives, or the effects are so embedded and triggered by other genes that there's no easy rubric for the effects of having certain alleles. The genes for intelligence, which is really just one score on an IQ test, haven't been found, let alone their distribution among the races. Now, so that's just one thing to keep in mind when people demand that you find the specific genes and their variance amongst the races. Now, most of biology was done without reference to specific genes. All biology before the discovery of the double helix was done without reference to specific genes. If this standard of demanding specific genes was applied consistently, and not just to humans, we wouldn't be allowed to infer that the behavior differences between a golden retriever and a pit bull were down to genetics. But of course, this standard is only applied to humans, and it's only applied to cognitive traits, and the resistance to hereditary arguments seems to most strongly impact discussions on race. Now, there is some resistance to heredity in general, and there's a small but waning resistance to heredity regarding gender differences. But even that, I suspect, is because they know that arguments for general heritability always end up bleeding over into arguments about race, and they kind of frame the debate about race. For example, the general heritability of IQ, right? And then we look at the variance, more variance within races than between races in regards to income. That sets up, that kind of frames the discussion regarding the racial differences, right? And so when you look at that, just that kind of starting point, it seems very unlikely that the racial differences are going to be much lower than 0.8 heritable, than 0.8 down to variance in genetics. Anyway, demanding that specific genes be found is arbitrarily raising the bar, right? This standard is invoked selectively, and it's invoked selectively so as to deny hereditary arguments. You don't have to find the genes to infer heritability. And this is done all over biology. They don't find specific genes to infer heritability. They use other ways. They use controlled environments, or they use factor analysis or some other way to infer heredity of a trait. Right? You don't need to find the specific genes. Most of biology was done before knowledge of genetics, or I'll say that. Most of biology was done before a great knowledge of genetics, so that statement is it's just wrong, right? And it's just an attempt to raise the bar to block out hereditary arguments. Anyway, the political context. When I talk about this, a lot of people will say, there's so much more to an individual than his race. Why do you focus on race? Why spending so much time on race? This is just divisive. This is just going to divide people and all this stuff. Well, between the years 1960 and 1970, the United States, France, Britain, Sweden, and probably many other historically European majority states changed their immigration policies to allow in people of African ancestry. And I know what people are going to say. The United States was not historically European majority, it was historically Native American. And in my next video, I'm going to talk a lot about stuff like that. I'm going to talk about the Native American situation in the United States and why that's kind of a not exactly good argument, but I don't want to talk about that here. Anyway, there's a lot of European majority states that are bringing in a lot of people of African ancestry, Native American ancestry from Latin America, and Caucasians from North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, bringing in a lot of new people, right? Now, this policy, this changing of immigration policy, in, say, France, it was done on two assumptions. One was that culture is ephemeral and can easily be broken down, which is actually an assumption I agree with. But two, that the differences in behavior between people of European ancestry and people of, say, African ancestry are primarily down to culture and environment, and whatever innate proportion of the difference is insignificant and trivial, whatever. That these populations will be indistinguishable behaviorally. You won't be able to distinguish them except by looking at, statistics. You'll be able to find some slight differences that only come out when looking at large numbers of members of the other race and, doing statistical analyses. But in your day-to-day life, it won't be a observable, noticeable difference between the races. Now, these assumptions were never proven. When doing things like introducing new compounds to a shampoo, what companies will do is they'll test it. They'll test it on, say, animals, then on human volunteers, before releasing the product into the market. Similarly, we would expect this theory, this hypothesis of multiracial states being workable to be tested in a small model community before being applied to national policy. Test your product before putting it to market. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the two assumptions above here are correct. At the very least, you would want to try multiracialism on a small scale to figure out how to make racial integration work, and to make sure you knew what you needed to do to achieve racial integration before applying it nationwide. Even if you're an environmental determinist in regards to all racial differences, you would want to do this. You would want to do something on a small scale and figure out how to do it before doing it on a large scale. You don't want your multiracial experiment to fail and spiral out of control because you didn't do the necessary trials and the necessary revisions. All of this is totally sensible. And of course, none of this was done because the policy was not implemented on the basis of some rational plan. The policy was implemented on the basis of a political push. Now, so far, the results of this immigration policy have been what was predicted by its detractors and has not been what was predicted by its enactors. For example, African immigrants to Sweden have not become behaviorally indistinguishable from indigenous Swedes, right? And same thing as African immigrants to Canada, African immigrants to Finland, African immigrants to Britain and France. And in none of these states can you... I would say that in none of these states can you blame racism, but I guess in Britain you could say, oh, the British Empire. In France you could say, oh, the French Empire. But the problem is the Africans in France and Britain, relatively speaking, behave no differently from the Africans in Sweden and Finland. And so you're going to say, oh, the reason Africans in Sweden are so poor and their neighborhoods so crime-ridden and why they're a net drain on social services and why they vote for political parties that promise them goodies at the expense of indigenous Swedes, that the reason this is happening is, oh, all those racist Swedes. Okay, what about Finland? Oh, all those racist Finns, right? The problem is this happens so often, over and over and over again, that the charge of historical oppression doesn't make any sense. And moreover, the fact that the results are precisely the same in all these different countries, that like it's not somehow worse in the United States, that the racial disparities are not worse in the United States. In fact, they might actually be a little bit smaller than they are in Britain and Sweden, places like that, right? It all puts the lie to this idea of historical oppression or some great embedded deep cultural oppressive thing or whatever. Right? Unless you're going to say, oh, this invisible white privilege, it exists everywhere. It exists in Finland. It exists in Sweden. And it just starts to get stupid, especially as you see other immigrant groups. You see Chinese immigrants to Britain performing as East Asians perform everywhere. You know, as the racial stratification in Brazil, like they do in Brazil. And you see, you know, East Asians in France performing as East Asians do wherever they are on the planet, right? Having higher IQs than Europeans and higher incomes than Europeans. All of this evidence taken together points to a more heredity explanation for all the stuff that's going on, not culture and environment or oppression or whatever. So you can contrast this experience with immigrant groups of various races to the great many European ethnicities who entered the United States and quickly became a single homogeneous blocks, right? The cultural or ethnic divisions between the Irish and the Italians and the Germans, right? These all got broken down. Okay, which is evidence that culture is ephemeral and easily broken down. Whereas the racial distinctions, which are more, I believe, are more a result of heredity, are more biological, are more hardwired, these remain. And when these races, visibly distinguishable, have differences in average outcomes, visibly distinguishable, people ask why. Why are there these racial disparities? The question will be answered. People will come to conclusions, and these conclusions will influence their political viewpoints, and they will vote their political viewpoints onto you in an involuntary manner, and this is happening right now. Okay? It's not a choice to deal in racial politics. You are dealing in racial politics. Okay? You are dealing with this form, I guess you could call it a form of racial conflict. Okay? So it's not a question of you are dealing with it. The question is, how are you going to deal with it? Are you going to recognize the disparities and proceed based on a recognition of what I believe is the correct hereditary viewpoint? Or are you going to proceed on what I believe is a false environmental viewpoint? The cultural hypothesis so far has not yielded any correct predictions, whereas the biological racialist hypothesis has so far yielded correct predictions everywhere. Correct predictions regarding the effects of immigration, correct predictions regarding the effect of affirmative actions, correct predictions regarding how civil rights were not going to have any real effects, which it hasn't. Okay? Now, European civilization is not completely destroyed yet. There's still time for the cultural hypothesis to work, if it can, but I don't think it even can. At least not in Europe. Now, in Singapore, you have a multiracial state. that is quote unquote working, that has a high degree of economic freedom and is very wealthy. But the thing is, there you have a self-selected population of capitalists. So while they are a mixture of all sorts of races, the entry into Singapore is a self-selection process, right? And they're self-selected to have a similar temperament and a self-selection to support economic freedom and tend to like to invest in a lot of things. Singapore is the way it is, both because of who is there, but also because of who's not there, right? And that's something to consider. Think about your home and the nature of your home, or the nature of a college, or the nature of anything, of any organization. The nature of that organization or home or party or group or whatever is based on who's there, but also based on who you're excluding and what you're excluding from your, group. Now, when someone comes up and says, why do you focus on race? A person's race tells us very little about him. They're missing the point. The point isn't about determining the nature of any given individual. The point is about aggregates, and people understand this, which is why you don't have these problems with when talking about gender differences or breeds of animals, right? People know what averages are and how they work, and so when someone says, well, race doesn't tell you anything about the individual, okay, they're being deliberately obtuse, okay? But even if they're not smart enough to know what an average is or how averages work, then they're not going to be able to make that objection in the first place, right? If they're not smart enough to know what an average is, they're not smart enough to make the objection that you're, generalizing that's not how all individuals work, right? So to make that objection means that they're being deliberately obtuse. And the fact that people understand how averages work when you talk about gender differences and they don't make this dumb argument in regards to gender differences is further confirmation of this idea that people are being deliberately obtuse in regards to race and only in regards to race. Waxing poetic. All right, so here's where I'm going to tell you how I really feel. To state the obvious, there are those who enter the argument on race with baseless preconceptions and a basket of fallacious memes. One race, the human race, more variance within than between, hybrid vigor, right? Hybrid vigor. The argument for hybrid vigor is a particularly serious example of this kind of just vapid repeating of things that you never really even knew, you just heard. All I have seen on this issue is the National Longitudinal Survey of Adolescent Health, which actually shows mixed-race kids having slightly worse health by a variety of measures and surveys. So what scant evidence there is, and there is scant evidence, shows no evidence of either hybrid vigor or outbreeding depression. The data says something much more mundane, intermediate outcomes, like you see with IQ. And if you've watched the video this far, it should be quite clear that there is an ocean of lies floating around about racial hereditarians. So what is the motive for all these lies? Well, the motive one is tempted to jump to for making all these lies is that these people are just brainwashed into the mystery of racism, as they call it. Mystery, as in mysticism, right? The mystery of racism. Civil rights, slavery, Martin Luther King, Jim Crow, colonization, exploitation, the Ku Klux Klan, black invention myths, right? The whole mystery of racism. And perhaps there is some of that. They're just so, in that thing. But I think that's a secondary factor because I used to be all enveloped by the mystery of racism. I went to public schools, and that didn't prevent me from reading the bell curve with an open mind. But I did keep my mouth shut for a long time. I think the two primary factors for the lies and personalization of the issues of race are responding to social cues and the innate desire to hate. Now, the social cues thing is pretty obvious, especially once you've publicly committed yourself to a position. In fact, it's been shown that once you publicly commit to a position, your mind closes up. So does this mean that I'm closed-minded because of my public commitment as well? Perhaps. I like to think this doesn't apply to me as much because I'm more aware of it, but that's, I would say that, wouldn't I? That's really for only an outsider could really judge that. But the need to hate. Now, this is a more exotic hypothesis, and this is, I think, is a more interesting hypothesis. I'm convinced that man has an innate need to hate some outgroup. Now, if you've been brainwashed, or you've brainwashed yourself into holding, these rabid, democratic, cultural, Marxist, Boasian, humanistic viewpoints, then you can't hate another race. You can't hate another religion for the most part, or you can't hate an ethnic group. Now I knew I just kind of blew out a bunch of terms there. Cultural, Marxist, humanist, Boyesian, right? And I'll describe all of these things in my next video, a biological viewpoint. But I'm just saying, if you're a social democrat, or what is called in the U.S. a progressive hippie liberal, whatever, you can't hate other groups. You have a very limited scope of who it is you're allowed to hate. Now, perhaps the modern social democrat can hate Muslims for their misogynist and various intrusive religious rules, which some like Pat Condell and Thunderfoot do, but the problem is that Muslims are oppressed, and the instinct of the social democrat is to always see the good in that which is non-Western and the bad in that which is Western, right? It's like a reflex, a bias, a tendency. So the more deranged social democrats, amazingly, they'll call people like Pat Condell and Thunderfoot bigots for hating Islam, for hating the more socially conservative and misogynistic aspects of Islam, and openly pronounce their intolerance for the entire religion, right? Anyway, if man has a general need to hate, who is the social democrat allowed to hate? Well, the answer is very simple: bigots. So in order to satisfy their need to hate, what do they need? They need bigots. And that's why they scrape and claw for any sign of bigotry and exaggerate the trivial harm done by teaching creationism to kids who aren't going to be biologists anyway. For example, the YouTube atheists talking about, oh, we got to debunk creationism, we got to fight creationism because it's holding back science. I mean, there's no evidence of that. I mean, is it preventing people who want to become evolutionary biologists from becoming evolutionary biologists? Like, what exactly is it holding back? Anyway, this is all explained beautifully by understanding that they need harm to be done by creationism because they need a reason to hate. All right, now there are a few social dialectic phonemes that one should look out for. I don't call them words or phrases. Well, I do, but I shouldn't call them words because unlike normal words or phrases, they lack any referent. 4 major social dialectic phonemes I know, and they're used around a lot, are racism, race realism, white supremacism, and scientific racism. Let's start off with racism. The first recorded use of the phoneme racism was by Leon Trotsky in 1930 in the book A History of the Russian Revolution, where he refers to ethnic separatists who don't want to be part of the Union as racists. So from its inception, the phoneme racist wasn't used to accurately describe a group, but was used as a vague slander. This is why everybody has their own personal definition of the word racist. So in a sense, the phoneme racist functions as a word for each individual, but has no reliable intersubjective definition like real words do. If I told you that Zaxelblacks was racist, using racist as an adjective here, or that Zaxelblacks was a racist, using racist as a noun, would you now have any new information about Zaxelblacks? No, the most you could say is that Zaxelblacks has some views in regards to race, which I describe as racist. In practice, when someone says an action is racist, or that a person is racist, to understand what they mean, you must ask for their personal definition of racist. For example, if I define racist as hatred for another race, then there is no point in calling anyone a racist, but to say that that person harbors racial hatred. And if I do call someone a racist, noun, or say that they are being racist, adjective, I still have to explain that by racist I mean race-based hatred. A counter-argument is that I'm deconstructing the word racist because it's been used against me so much. And there is some truth to that. I certainly wouldn't have bothered to deconstruct the word racist if it hadn't been used against me so much. And rather brutally, this fact has been used to discount my deconstruction. So what you have is a bunch of people beating me over the head with this term racist, and I'm not allowed to deconstruct this term because since I'm being beat with it constantly, I'm now a vested interest. Oh, it's like someone beating me on the head with a hammer, and I'm trying to take the hammer away from them. Oh, you're just trying to take the hammer away from me because I keep beating you on the head with it. Like, well, no shit. Okay. Next, race realism. Race realism is a phoneme made up by Jared Taylor. as, practically speaking, a synonym for racial hereditarianism. But really, not really. Like, I guess it's a synonym for more towards the hereditarian side of the hereditarian egalitarian spectrum. But really, race realism does not refer to any organized political movement. There are no race realist meetups in the way there are communist, social democrat, or libertarian meetups. So what does race realist really mean? It doesn't really mean anything. It's just a word that a bunch of people with a strange variety of views have decided to call themselves. So when someone uses the phonem race realist, it means they probably haven't heard of or don't know what racial hereditarian means, and they don't know of the origins of the phonem race realist. Now, I'm a big fan of Jared Taylor, but I'm not a fan of the term race realist. So when someone says race realist a whole bunch of times, that means they don't know anything. Okay, or they don't know what that term means or the origin of it. Next, white supremacist. Now, this phonem is very problematic because while we generally know what white means, meaning of European descent, what does supremacist mean? First off, is it descriptive or prescriptive? If it is descriptive, then supreme refers to some standard of being superior or inferior. If one defined supreme as being the tallest and was a white supremacist out of the belief that people of European descent were the tallest, then his descriptive white supremacism can be easily verified or falsified. If white people are the tallest, then his descriptive white supremacy is correct. And that's really all there is to say about that. If the white supremacism is prescriptive, that is to put people defined as white in a position defined as supreme, then that is an ought claim and is thus non-cognitive, meaning it is not truth apt. You can't say that prescriptive white supremacism or black supremacism is correct or incorrect. And, preemptive fuck you to all these people who say, well, I guess you can't objectively say so, but we can say in our hearts or something dumb like that. Like, I hate you people. I hate you. All these people who say, yeah, you're right, base values can't be objectively said to be true or false, but we can say that you're an asshole or something like that. Well, you thinking he's an asshole is based on differences in base value, which is not right or wrong. God damn it, I hate these people who don't know what a base value is in practice. Now, in practice, I personally have never come into contact with someone that I would call a prescriptive white supremacist. I have come into contact with people posing as prescriptive white supremacists in an attempt to discredit European racial separatist groups, but never a genuine prescriptive white supremacist. There's been a lot of people going onto forums, people who are with like Searchlight or Anti-Racist Action, who pose as these ridiculous caricatured white supremacists saying, I hate Negroes, exterminate them, blah, 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 blah. And they get booted and found out. They're saying, wait a minute, I was acting like I think they would want me to act. Why wasn't I popular there? Well, because those people don't actually exist. Anyway, next we have scientific racism. When someone uses the term scientific racism, the first question one must ask is, what do they mean by racism? Now, even if we assume that racism is defined as racial hereditarianism on a specific trait in question, then scientific racism is just the defense of a racial hereditarian position with quote-unquote science. Now, this is further problematic if you're not retarded, because now you're getting into the philosophy of science, right? And now if you don't, philosophy of science, what's that? Yeah, you're retarded. So defining what is scientific and what is non-scientific and what is unscientific or what is anti-scientific. So in order to use the phonem scientific racism, you must both define what constitutes racism, which we've already been over why that's problematic, and what constitutes science. Now, the reader or listener at this point of my kind of deconstruction here is probably either humored or annoyed, because it's quite clear that these terms don't warrant the level of deconstruction that I've given them. Right? The silliness of these terms of this deconstruction is palpable, and that's because the fakeness of these words is palpable. It would be like deconstructing what someone means when they call you a poop face, okay, and say, well, you call me a poop face. Do you mean that I have a bunch of poop on my face? Well, I don't have a bunch of poop on my face. Do you mean that my face is made of poo? Well, my face is clearly not made of poo, so you're calling me a poop face. That doesn't refer to anything real. That's just an insult, right? That's kind of silly. That's kind of a silly thing to do, right? And that's why these deconstruction of, racism, scientific racism, white supremacism, and race realism, why these deconstructions seem kind of silly. And they seem kind of silly, except for the problem is that the great asses of the masses, when they hear a charge of racism, what do? Do they just throw it off like a dumb insult, like poop face, like it really is? No. They furrow their brows and they stroke their chins in somber contemplation about what is meant by poop face, or I'm racist. Racist. I'm gonna put my pipe here and put my glasses on and really ponder this. Is he a racist? Let's get philosophical here. What does racist really mean? Let's have a discussion about that. Yes, no. Okay. Now, to someone who wishes to argue about this, say you want to go in and you want to argue with a closed-minded racial egalitarian. If you're going to talk to just a normal person about this, that's fine. But if you're going to talk to someone who's big on, humanities, I went to college and I listened to what the professor said, therefore I know what the world is. Those kinds of people. My first recommendation is don't talk to those people. You'll bleed yourself white dealing with those people. Take it from someone who has done that, and take it from someone who has made that mistake. Don't make that mistake. And you can tell rather quickly if someone is genuine, someone's open-minded, or if they're just making hay, if they're just, getting involved in political activism, that they go on these crusades, that they're the zealots for the status quo and the defenders of all that is dull and ordinary and conventional. If they're one of those kinds of people, don't bother dealing with them. But if you argue with a group of them, right, if you get into that, and they'll get in these groups, what you'll find is that they will cite their numbers as evidence of you being wrong. And then they will cite their own opinion of you as evidence that you have a bad reputation. Okay, YouTube atheists do this all the time. And they'll say like, the YouTube atheist community has a negative opinion of fringe elements. This is evidence that fringe elements has a bad reputation. Well, which is stupid, because they're basically like a semi-coherent group, and they come to group positions on things. And so they come to a group position like they're basically acting as a single entity. And this single entity says, you're dumb, you're a butthole, buttface. And so that's evidence that you have a bad reputation, because there's numbers of us. But the problem is they function as a single group, so it's not like, so that's the stupid game they play. And they're of course in complete control of what they believe, and so they get to use what they believe as evidence of your reputation being bad, right? And their self-delusion is so complete that they don't even recognize that they're doing this, because they don't even recognize themselves as engaging in this kind of groupthink, which is obvious to anyone who's not in that, what I've called the atheist cult. And I'm an atheist. It's not saying not believing in God is bad, but I'm just saying that is what I've already said. But if you insist on arguing with these people, the first thing you will find is that closed-minded egalitarians, what they want to do is they want to avoid big, open, conceptual discussion. Right? Because like what you saw here in my presentation is that I want to talk about lots of things and I want to tie them together, because these multiple lines of evidence, they all compound on each other and they all make a big old coherent case. What the closed-minded egalitarian will do is he will focus on little errors. He'll focus on some crappy sample in some study, or some trivia that wasn't reported, right? Or how Rushton cited Penthouse in one of his papers, and they'll make endless personal attacks, right? The purpose is to find some detail or some personal crap or some quote and latch onto it and make the discussion about that detail and avoid the big picture at all costs. Now, I like to describe this in kind of a military analogy. The racial hereditarian is like a small task force, is like a small force that has a bunch of tanks, a bunch of artillery, excellent aircraft, long-range snipers and all that stuff, while the racial egalitarian doesn't have a whole lot of tanks, planes, or anything, or artillery or anything like that, but what they do have is a bunch of men. Big old manpower. So what they want to do is they want to neutralize your tanks, planes, and artillery. And the way they neutralize that is they get you to fight in swamps, or they get you to fight in forests, or in cities, or in hills, or in mountains, right? They want you to spend a week fighting, in order to advance one block down a city, and in order to smash your teeth going through their trench works that they build up in a swamp/forest area, right? That's what they want to do. And so what they'll do is they'll bring up these quotes, they'll bring up something you said in the past and hold you to it, and their goal is to close the focus into this mare's nest of particular prick points, and it's intensely aggravating. And it's the kind of fight that completely nullifies the advantages of the racial hereditarians. Okay? The racial hereditarian wins when all of the lines of evidence are taken in together. When the racial hereditarian successfully points out that the egalitarian isn't the default position, that there's just as much of a burden of proof on him as there is on the hereditarian, and he has to make a positive case too, right? And to be open, to fly out and to look at the big picture, to say the debate at heart is about evolution. What are you saying? What are you saying? It's 10%, it's 20%, and the racial egalitarian who doesn't want to go down on any position, they're just going to say up. I don't know what it is. Oh, so you say it's 100% environment. Well, I never said that, right? They want to get you hung up on a certain point. They want to get you hung up on this sample or that sample or this misquoting of this study, right? That's what they want to get into. They want to avoid the big concepts. They want to avoid getting down to actual positions, right? They want to get out of the open fields into the closed terrain. But I think this issue is finished. I'm done talking about this. You can argue any point forever, and you can argue for any position forever. Maybe not forever, but there's just so much complexity in the world that you can find reasons to believe anything till the day you die, right? Reasonable people won't do that, and I think that I've reached the point of limited returns on this issue of race, and I think I'm going to stop that right here.